Picture this. It's sometime in 1965, maybe early 1966, and you're standing at Famoso Raceway up in Bakersfield, California, watching the biggest gas class race on the West Coast. The car everyone's talking about rolls into the staging lanes, and it doesn't look right. It's unpainted. Just raw metal and primer sitting under the California sun with a hand-lettered name on the door and a supercharged Chrysler Hemi sitting between the frame rails, ready to go. Nobody knows if this thing is going to hold together because the team just finished building it in the last few weeks and they basically raced it straight from the shop floor without even a shakedown pass. And that car goes out and beats Stone, Woods, Cook. Beats everybody. Runs all the way to the final round where it loses on a hole shot to a guy in an Austin sedan who gets the jump and holds it to the stripe. That car was the Bones Pisano 1933 Willys. And this is the story of how it got there and why almost nobody talks about it today. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about forgotten drag racing history. If you're someone who loves the golden era of American motorsport and the unsung heroes who built it from the ground up, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. So the three names on the door are the whole story right there. You've got driver and engine builder Robert Bones Balough, who was probably the single best supercharged Hemi builder on the West Coast at the time. Car owner Gary Dubach, who provided the 1933 Willys body and the platform to build from. And Joe Pisano, who founded Vinolia Pistons and built the forged racing piston industry basically from scratch, and who supplied not just sponsorship money, but the actual Chrysler Hemi engine that turned this car from competitive into genuinely fearsome. Three guys from Southern California drag racing culture who came together at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right class, and built something that deserved way more recognition than history ended up giving it. To understand why any of this matters, you've got to understand what a gas supercharged was in 1964 and 1965. The gas classes were the NHRA's answer to the question of what happens when you take a real production automobile, strip it down, and build it into the fastest thing it can possibly be while still using gasoline instead of nitromethane. No fuel. No exotic injection systems burning 90% nitro. Just gasoline, a supercharger, and whatever you could legally cram into a production body. The classes were divided by a weight-to-displacement ratio. So A/gas supercharged meant your total car weight, divided by your engine cubic inches, had to fall between 5 and 8.99 pounds per cubic inch. What that meant in practice was that heavy cars with big motors were in the same class as light cars with small motors, and the teams that figured out how to game that math while building real power had the advantage. And A/gas supercharged was the fastest of all of them. Here's what most people don't realize. These weren't bracket racers or street cars with a few mods. By the mid-1960s, these were purpose-built race machines wearing production body shells as a formality, wearing fiberglass body panels and plexiglass windows and straight tube front axles and the minimum amount of interior required by the rulebook. The street car fiction was basically gone. What was left was pure performance wrapped in the body of a 1933 Willys or a 1941 Willys or a vintage Austin or a Ford Anglia. And it was spectacular. These cars stood nose high on their front suspensions and went down the track standing on their rear bumpers, and the fans absolutely lost their minds every time one of them launched. A/gas supercharged was the headline act of a complete drag racing culture that called itself the Gasser Wars, and the teams that competed in it were some of the most colorful and competitive characters in the history of the sport. Which brings us to why the 1933 Willys Coupe was the weapon of choice. Willys Overland built the Model 77 from 1933 to 1936 as the cheapest car in Depression-era America. We're talking about a car that cost under $500 new, with a tiny four-cylinder engine making 48 horsepower and a curb weight somewhere around 2,000 pounds. The wheelbase was 100 inches, which is a full foot shorter than most of the Ford coupes and sedans that dominated early drag racing. By the late 1950s, these cars were worthless junk. Ohio George Montgomery famously bought his from a wrecking yard for $100 in 1958, where the yard owner's grandchildren had been using it as a plaything. You could not find a more overlooked piece of American transportation history. But here's the thing. Everything that made the Willys a joke on the road made it a monster at the dragstrip. The weight was nothing. The wheelbase was short, which meant more weight transfer to the rear tires on the launch. The body was small and compact, which meant the nose-high gasser stance looked absolutely insane on these cars, in the best possible way. And because the cars were light, they could run a relatively large engine and still qualify favorably in the weight per cubic inch math that determined class placement. A 1933 Willys at 2,800 pounds with a 465 cubic inch Hemi works out to just over 6 pounds per cubic inch, which sits right in the middle of A/GS. You're giving up some weight to guys running smaller motors, but you're making it up with raw power. And the lighter cars with bigger engines always had the advantage in the long run because power wins drag races. Now, Robert Balogh, the guy who went by Bones, was born in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which is where the nickname apparently came from because when he was a kid back east, somebody started calling him Bones and it stuck for the rest of his life. His family moved to Southern California when he was 12, and by 14, his uncle had bought him a 1934 Buick Limited coupe for $35. He already had his California driver's license somehow, and the rest basically writes itself. He started racing at Lyons Drag Strip in Long Beach around 1955, and in 1960, he went to work at Iskandarian Racing Cams, Iski's shop. If you know anything about the camshaft wars of the 1960s gasser era, you know what that means. Ed Iskandarian was one of the most important figures in the aftermarket performance industry, and his company was right in the middle of one of the most entertaining advertising feuds in drag racing history with Engel Cams over whose product was making the big gasser teams run faster. Bones was grinding cams, building engines, running the dynamometer, and accumulating knowledge that you simply could not buy or learn from a book. And by the time he left, he had over 250 wins at Lyons Drag Strip with various cars built around Iski equipment. His national breakthrough came with Big John Mazmanian. Mazmanian was an Armenian-American candy distributor who became one of the most flamboyant and distinctive car owners in the history of A/gas racing. His cars were always candy apple red and always immaculate and always fast, and Bones built him a supercharged Hemi that made 824 horsepower from 467 cubic inches. Together they became the first stock-bodied car to break into the 9-second range. They ran a 9.77 at Bakersfield around early 1964. Their car appeared on the cover of Hot Rod magazine. Revell made a model kit of it. The Mazmanian Willys with Bones Balough's engine was the car that everyone was chasing and everyone was scared of, and it absolutely defined what A/gas supercharged could be at its best. So Bones knew how to build these motors. That is established beyond any question. And when the Mazmanian relationship ended and Gary Dubach approached him about running the 1933 Willys, he already had the reputation and the skills to make something special happen. The exact circumstances of how Dubach and Bones got together aren't well documented, and what Gary Dubach did before or after this partnership isn't really recorded anywhere I could find. What we know is that Dubach owned the car and brought Bones in as driver and engine builder. And in the early phase, the car ran a 364 cubic inch Chevrolet small block with a supercharger. The Chevy setup was running 143 miles per hour, which was competitive, but wasn't going to knock Ohio George off his throne. And it wasn't going to beat the top Stone, Woods, Cook cars on a consistent basis. Then Joe Pisano showed up. Joe Pisano was born in 1927, and he founded Vinolia Pistons, which produced the first forged racing pistons. Cast pistons were what everybody used, and cast pistons had a fundamental problem, which was that the casting process left tiny voids and inconsistencies in the metal that could cause catastrophic failure under high boost and high heat. Forged pistons were stronger and more consistent, and Vinolia's product was one of the key components that made the horsepower explosion of the early 1960s possible. When you put a supercharged Hemi together that was going to see 800 horsepower, you needed pistons that wouldn't grenade themselves on the third pass, and Vinolia was making those pistons. Pisano had money from a successful business, and he had deep connections to the drag racing world, and he had a genuine passion for the sport. And when he met up with Bones and Balough at Bakersfield, he had a proposition: put a Chrysler Hemi in the car. He'd supply the engine. They'd all run it together. Partnership. The Hemi went in. And immediately the car started destroying itself. The problem was torque. A supercharged 392 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi bored and stroked to somewhere around 465 cubic inches, with a 671 GMC blower running about 15 pounds of boost, makes somewhere north of 800 horsepower. And it makes it with a torque curve that will tear the rear axle out of most any drivetrain that isn't specifically built to handle it. They snapped 6 rear axles in a single day of testing. 6 in one day. The car was basically a machine for destroying axles, and they had to completely rethink the drivetrain before they could make a serious pass. Now, you might be thinking that sounds like a nightmare scenario for a small independent team with limited resources. And you'd be right. But here's the thing about guys who come up through places like the Iski shop grinding cams and running the dyno. They don't walk away from a problem just because it's hard. They figure it out. That's the culture these men came from. You didn't have a factory engineering department or a 6-figure development budget. You had your knowledge, your hands, and the other guys on the team, and you solved it or you went home. They solved it. They reinforced the drivetrain, upgraded the axle shafts, rebuilt the rear end around hardware that could actually survive the torque, and went back to Lyons to race. Then on the third race out, an axle sheared at the hub while the car was on the move, and Bones rode it sideways into a pole or a wall. One eyewitness described watching the brand new Bones Pisano blown 33 flip 4 or 5 times right off the starting line. Bones himself said later in his career that this was the one time he wrecked a race car in his entire life. Which, if you think about that record across the amount of racing he did, is almost unbelievable. The car was destroyed. The original body was gone. This is where it gets really interesting. Because what a team does after the worst possible outcome tells you everything about what they're actually made of. A lot of programs would have folded right there. The car is gone. The build was expensive. The crash was violent. The class is brutally competitive. You could walk away and nobody would blame you. But Bones and Balough and Pisano didn't walk away. Friends helped them build a new 1933 Willys body. And Bones salvaged the 2 original doors from the wrecked car and installed them on the replacement. There was no time to paint it. There was no time for a proper shakedown. The March meet at Bakersfield was coming up and they were going to race. Look, this is the part of the story that gets me every time I think about it. That bare metal, unpainted car that showed up at Famoso looking like it belonged in a body shop instead of a staging lane ran 9.38 seconds at 155 miles an hour. The JRThompson.net account of this car, which quotes directly from Hot Rod magazine period coverage, says the 33 ran better than the 41, meaning it outperformed the legendary Masmanian Willys that Bones had built his reputation on. And it beat Stone, Woods, Cook and everyone else right up until Junior Thompson got the jump on them in the final. Think about what that means for a second. The car that just crashed a few weeks ago, rebuilt from almost nothing, bare metal and borrowed doors, running the fastest time in A/gas Supercharged that day. Against the best teams in the country. On a car that had never made a proper shakedown pass. There's a word for that kind of performance and it isn't luck. That's the product of 3 men who knew exactly what they were doing, who had built the right combination, who had survived the worst outcome and come back anyway. And that result, that 9.38 at 155 in an unpainted car at Bakersfield, is the moment that defines the Bones Pisano program for anyone who was there to see it. Here's what most people don't realize about that time at the March meet. Bakersfield wasn't just any race. The March meet at Famoso Raceway was the single most prestigious gas class event on the West Coast and arguably in the country outside of the U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis. The field that showed up there represented the absolute best of what A/gas Supercharged had to offer. If you ran well at Bakersfield, you ran well against the best. There was no asterisk, no weak field, no asterisk on the result. The BDP 33 beat that field in bare metal with salvaged doors and a combination that had just been rebuilt from a destroyed car. That result was real, and everyone who was there knew it. So let's talk about what was actually in this car. Because the engineering here is genuinely fascinating, and it tells you a lot about how these small independent teams were able to compete at the highest level through pure mechanical intelligence. The heart of it was a 392 cubic inch early Chrysler Hemi block board and stroked to approximately 465 cubic inches. The 392 was a great block for this kind of build because it was strong and it responded well to displacement increases. And the early Hemi combustion chamber design was actually better suited to supercharger applications than some of the later stuff because the hemispherical chamber gave you room for the valves and created a combustion space that handled boost well without creating the hot spots that would cause detonation. The supercharger was a GMC 671 Roots type blower running about 15% overdrive, producing somewhere around 15 pounds of boost. The 671 was the universal blower of the gasser era. It came from two-cycle Detroit diesel truck engines, and drag racers figured out pretty quickly that it was an excellent air pump for gasoline-powered race motors. Think about that for a second. A piece of equipment designed to scavenge exhaust from a diesel truck engine became the defining performance component of an entire era of drag racing. That's hot rodding in a nutshell. You take something designed for one purpose, you look at the underlying physics, and you apply it somewhere nobody intended. Running 15 pounds of boost on a 465 cubic inch Hemi with proper fuel delivery and timing, you're looking at somewhere north of 800 horsepower. Probably a lot north. Based on the power levels Bones documented from the essentially identical Mazmanian motor, the BDP car was likely making power numbers in the 820 to 850 range at minimum and possibly more as they developed the combination. Fuel delivery was almost certainly mechanical fuel injection. The Hilborn units were dominant in this class at the time, and they gave you the precise metering you needed to keep an 800 horsepower supercharged engine alive under full load. Ignition was a magneto because you needed a spark source that would keep firing consistently at the RPM levels these engines operated at without the voltage drop you'd get from a stock ignition system. The transmission was either a B&M Hydro Stick or a Chrysler TorqueFlite automatic, because by the mid-1960s everyone running A/GS competitively had gone to automatics for consistency on the hit. The manual transmission guys were losing reaction time and consistency at the launch, and in a class where hundredths of a second determined the outcome, that mattered enormously. The rear end was a Ford 9-inch with somewhere around 4.88 to 1 gears in a Posey traction unit. M&H Racemaster or Goodyear Blue Streak slicks on Halibrand magnesium wheels in the rear. Narrow bias ply fronts because you needed the weight up front as low as possible to maximize rear weight transfer. Plexiglass everywhere. Fiberglass everywhere you could get away with it. The whole car came in around 2,800 pounds, which put it right in the sweet spot of the A/GS weight break. Pisano's contribution wasn't just money. Vinolia-forged pistons went into this motor, obviously. And there's a telling detail in the period accounts where Bones specifically replaced a Howard cam in the engine with an Iskandarian cam. His loyalty to his mentor Ed Iskey was genuine, and he knew from years of dynamometer testing at the Isky shop exactly what their cams would do on a given combination. That kind of specific knowledge is what separated the good engine builders from the great ones. Anyone could buy parts out of a catalog. Bones knew from thousands of dyno pulls exactly which grind profile would produce the best power curve for a supercharged Hemi at a specific displacement and boost level. That knowledge was earned through years of tedious, repetitive work on the dynamometer, and it was priceless. The other key engineering detail was the main bearing cap situation. The early 392 blocks used a stud girdle arrangement for the main caps, which was fine up to a point, but not ideal for the power levels they were running. So they went to 4-bolt steel main caps, which was a more direct and positive clamping method that kept the crankshaft in place under loads that would have walked the original caps right out of the block. Late-model Hemi connecting rods with shorter length than the originals gave better bottom end geometry. The whole motor was built with the obsessive attention to detail that you'd expect from someone who'd spent years tuning on the dynamometer and accumulating hundreds of wins. The chassis itself followed the Gasser formula that was becoming standardized by this point, but the execution is what mattered. The stock Willys ladder frame was retained because the rules required it, but it was heavily reinforced everywhere stress could build up. The front suspension was a straight tubular beam axle with coilover shocks and ladder bars replacing the original independent front suspension. This was lighter and simpler, and it created the nose-high stance that made Gassers look the way they looked. The rear used a traditional leaf spring arrangement with ladder bars to control axle rotation under power. The engine was set back as far as the rules allowed, which was a maximum of 10% of the wheelbase. All of this was about one thing: getting as much weight as possible transferred to the rear slicks at the moment of launch while keeping the car controllable enough that the driver could actually steer it down the quarter mile. The driving style required for these cars was genuinely different from what fuel car guys were doing. The axle snapback on launch was violent. The cars would stand on the rear bumper, and the driver had to be fast and precise on the wheel to keep them pointed straight, and then manage them through the transition when the front end came back down. Bones had done this hundreds of times with various cars at Lions, and he was exceptionally good at it, which is why the teams wanted him. There's a reason he only wrecked once in his entire career. Now the competition context really matters here because the BDP Willys didn't exist in isolation. They were racing in a world that included some of the best and most famous Gasser teams ever assembled. Stone, Woods, and Cook was the operation run by Fred Stone and Tim Woods with Doug "Cookie" Cook behind the wheel of a 1941 Willys, and they were probably the most famous team in the class for reasons that went beyond performance. Cook was black and Stone and Woods were white, and in 1964, that was an act of visible defiance against everything segregated America told you about who belonged in which spaces together. Their car was iconic. They were touring constantly, and they were fast. Beating them was a statement. Ohio George Montgomery was the standard. He was running out of Dayton, Ohio with a 1933 Willys that he'd bought from a junkyard for $100. And he had won the A/GS class at the NHRA U.S. Nationals in 1959, 1960, 1961, and 1963. He was the king of the Gassers in a way that wasn't hyperbole. It was just a description of what the record showed. K.S. Pittman was running a 1941 Willys out of Texas. Junior Thompson was campaigning an Austin sedan with a Hemi that was a class-correct alternative to the Willys, and he used it to beat BDP on that whole shot at Bakersfield. Big John Mazmanian was still out there running the Candy Apple Red 41 that Bones had built his reputation on before the split. The Malakote brothers. The Kohler brothers. Shores and Hess. This was a deep and competitive field. In that company, the BDP 33 was running at the very top. The 9.38 at 155 was a pass that beat everything in class that day at Bakersfield. And at the 1967 NHRA U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis Raceway Park, They finished runner-up in A/GS to Ohio George Montgomery himself. That's the biggest race in American drag racing, and they went all the way to the final. That result against that competition is not a footnote. That's a legitimately elite performance that belongs in the conversation with anything the more famous teams accomplished that year. A 1969 period photograph exists showing the BDP-33 going head-to-head with the Stone, Woods, and Cook Willys at Bakersfield, confirming they were still at it and still in the mix deep into the era. The car appeared in the October 1965 issue of Carcraft. Period photographs show match racing situations at various Southern California tracks. The Jackson Brothers Video Company produced a gasser tape that specifically lists Balogh, Dubach, and Pisano among the featured teams and describes the footage as some of the best nostalgia material on gassers ever recorded, which means actual color film of this car in competition exists somewhere in the world right now. The economics of all this were straightforward, and they tell you a lot about what it actually took to sustain a competitive A/gas program in the mid-1960s. Match racing was the lifeblood of A/gas competition. Promoters would pay appearance money to the top teams, and then those teams would go out and race each other on Friday and Saturday nights at tracks all over the country. The top A/GS teams were genuinely touring operations, running dozens of dates per year. Stone, Woods, and Cook reportedly ran 53 dates between April and October in 1964 alone. 3 to 4 races a week sometimes. You needed the car to be reliable. You needed it to be fast. And you needed the combination of performance and reputation that got you the appearance call from the promoter, because appearance money was often the difference between a program that could sustain itself and one that couldn't. BDP had all of that by 1966. They had the speed. They had the result. They had a story that promoters could sell, the team that crashed and came back in bare metal and beat everybody at Bakersfield. That's the kind of narrative that puts people in grandstands. But it couldn't last. Nothing in the gasser era lasted. And this is where the story shifts from triumph to the kind of slow dissolution that ended most racing partnerships in this period. The first crack came in 1967, when the NHRA changed the rules to allow late model bodies in the gas classes. Ohio George switched to a Ford Mustang. Stone, Woods, and Cook went to a newer body. The whole aesthetic that made the gassers what they were, those menacing little Depression-era economy cars standing on their bumpers, started disappearing from the class that had been built around them. And simultaneously, the funny car phenomenon was exploding. Here's the thing about funny cars. They offered everything that the gasser format offered, the altered wheelbase production bodies, the supercharged engines, the spectacular launches, but they did it with more speed, more visual drama, and most importantly, more money from sponsors and promoters. Big John Mazmanian quit gassers for funny cars in 1968. More money, more spectacle, more sponsor interest. The market was moving. Joe Pisano saw it clearly. He wanted to build a funny car. Bones wanted to keep racing gassers. That divergence is basically the end of the partnership right there, and it happened around 1967. Now, you might be thinking that this kind of split is unusual or dramatic. It really wasn't. Almost every gasser partnership ended this way. The sport evolved, the economics changed, and the people involved had different visions for where they wanted to go. There was no falling out as far as anyone has documented. No bad blood. Just a recognition that the world had moved on and the three men who had built something remarkable together were going to take different paths from that point forward. Pisano went on to build a funny car operation that became one of the most respected in NHRA racing. He sponsored drivers including Mike Dunn and Dale Poulda and Glenn Mikers. And most importantly, he mentored a young driver named Cruz Pedregon, who he eventually introduced to team owner Larry Miner. Pedregon won the NHRA Funny Car World Championship in 1992. Think about the through line there. A guy who started by making forged pistons that could survive 800 horsepower in a gasser ends up mentoring a world champion funny car driver 3 decades later. That's not a footnote in someone's career. That's an arc that connects 2 entire eras of drag racing through one man's passion for the sport. Pisano was inducted into the SEMA Hall of Fame that same year, 1992, for his contributions to the racing industry through Venolia pistons. Then on July 21, 1991, during the Mopar Mile High Nationals at Bandimere Speedway in Colorado, Joe Pisano collapsed on the return road immediately after watching his car make a qualifying pass and died in the arms of his crew. He was 63 years old. The entire drag racing community felt it. Steve Gibbs helped create the California Hot Rod Reunion, partly inspired by wanting to honor figures like Pisano, who had given everything to the sport and deserved to be remembered. Bones took a different path after the BDP split, and this is where it gets really interesting because the connections in this world were so tight that one partnership ending just led directly into another one beginning. About a year after the BDP program wound down, Tim Woods of Stone, Woods, and Cook reached out to Bones. Fred Stone had retired. Doug Cook had been injured. And Woods had a 1968 Shelby GT Mustang. He wanted to run in the declining gas class circuit. So for a period you had the Stone, Woods, and Bones combination running a 467 cubic inch Hemi in a Mustang. And that car ran 8.80 seconds on its first outing and eventually recorded a best of 8.76 at 161 miles per hour. Let me put that in perspective. The BDP 33 Willys had run 9.38. The Stone, Woods, and Bones Mustang ran 8.76. That's 0.6 of a second faster, which in drag racing terms is an enormous jump. Some of that was the car. Some of that was continued development of the engine combination. But a lot of it was Bones Balough continuing to get better at what he already did better than almost anyone. They toured nationally through 1969, racing alongside K.S. Pittman and Junior Thompson and Ohio George, trying to keep the gasser segment alive against the tide that was clearly running against them. By then Bones had a baby on the way and the gas classes were dying, and he stepped away from driving. He went back to Iskandarian's shop. 4 decades he was Iski's tuning and dyno testing wizard, and the institutional knowledge he carried from the 1960s into the shop made that operation better than it would have been without him. He was the living connection between the gasser wars and the modern camshaft industry, and Ed Iskandarian knew exactly how valuable that was. The recognition came later, but it came. Bones was inducted into the West Coast Drag Racing Hall of Fame in 2000 and the East Coast Drag Racing Hall of Fame in 2006. And in 2008, he and Ed Iskandarian shared the Wally Parks Motorsports Sportsman Award, which is one of the highest honors in the sport. The International Drag Racing Hall of Fame inducted him in 2020. He appeared at the 2003 Gasser reunion at Thompson Drag Raceway in Ohio alongside Big John Masmanian and Junior Thompson and Ohio George Montgomery and Don Garlett. He told a reporter that drag racing had kept him young. As of the last reports available, he was still building engines and showing up at events well into his later years. That longevity in the sport tells you something about the man. Gary Dubach remains essentially a mystery. There is no public record of what he did before the partnership or after it. No photographs I could find anywhere. No biographical information. No interviews. No Hall of Fame entries. He brought the car and he partnered with 2 men who became legends, and then he disappears from the historical record completely. If anyone watching this has information about Gary Dubach, I genuinely want to know. Leave it in the comments. Send me an email. Whatever works. Because this man was part of something significant, and he deserves to be more than a name on a door that nobody can tell you anything about. Now here's the thing about the car itself, and this is the part that haunts me a little bit. The original body was destroyed in the Lions crash. The replacement body, the bare metal car that ran 9.38 at Bakersfield with the salvaged original doors bolted on, competed from roughly 1965 through 1967 or possibly 1969 based on that period photograph at Bakersfield. And then what? Nobody knows. Ohio George's 33 Willys is in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. The Stone, Woods, Cook 41 Willys is in the Wally Parks NHRA Motorsports Museum in Pomona. The BDP car has no known resting place. It may be in private hands unrecognized. It may have been parted out decades ago. It may exist somewhere in a barn or a garage or a storage unit with people who don't know what they have. That particular mystery doesn't have a resolution I can give you, and honestly it bothers me more than it probably should. Because this car earned its place next to those other machines in a museum. It earned it at Bakersfield, and it earned it at Indianapolis, and it earned it every Friday and Saturday night on the match racing circuit across Southern California. The fact that it doesn't have that recognition says more about how history gets written than it does about what the car actually accomplished. What the car has instead of museum status is a specific kind of community recognition that tells you how the people who were there actually remember it. Bill Bennett's comprehensive Gasser Wars article in Die-Cast X magazine names Bones Pisano as one of the defining A/GS programs of the era, right alongside Stone, Woods, Cook and Ohio George and K.S. Pittman. That's not a casual mention. That's a historian who studied the class extensively, placing BDP in the top tier of programs that mattered. The East Coast Drag Racing Hall of Fame features period photographs of the car in their California Gasser series. The Lions Automobilia Foundation Hall of Fame page for Bones Balough documents the partnership and what it achieved. The JRThompson.net website, maintained by Junior Thompson's family and containing some of the richest primary source material on A/GS racing anywhere online, has dedicated pages to Bones and to the BDP car with eyewitness accounts and Hot Rod magazine excerpts that describe what that car actually did on the track. And here's a detail that tells you exactly where serious students of the Gasser era have always placed this car. Precision Miniatures produced a 1/18 scale diecast of the BDP 33 as part of their limited Gasser series. Catalog number PM7. Only 1,750 pieces released in 2005, with Bob Balough listed as driver. Precision Miniatures was selective about which cars they immortalized in that series. The lineup was Ohio George, Stone, Woods, Cook, K.S. Pittman, Jack Coonrod, Hills Brothers, and the Bones Pisano 1933 Willys. That's the company it's in. And if you know anything about the diecast collector world, you know that getting selected for a limited production run like that isn't random. Somebody at Precision Miniatures knew the history and knew that the BDP 33 belonged in that group. That decision validates what the track results already prove. Don Montgomery's 1993 book, Supercharged Gas Coupes and Sedans Remembering the 60s, almost certainly covers the BDP car with period photograph. Montgomery was the most thorough documentarian of this class, and his book is considered the definitive written record of what happened in the Gasser Wars. The Jackson Brothers Gasser tape exists with actual color footage of the car in competition. The SEMA Hall of Fame bio for Joe Pisano specifically calls out the Gasser partnership as part of his legacy. The material is there for anyone who wants to dig deep enough to find it. Here's what most people don't realize about what the BDP story represents beyond the performance results and the competition history. This wasn't a factory program. Nobody at Chrysler was writing checks to Bones Balough and Gary Dubach and Joe Pisano. This was three guys from Southern California car culture who understood engines and racing and had enough combined resources and talent to build something genuinely world-class out of a Depression-era economy car and a truck-engine supercharger and forged pistons that were being manufactured in a small shop by a man who saw a problem with cast components and solved it. Pisano's forged pistons went into the motor. Bones's Iskandarian connections put the right camshaft in it. Dubach's car became the platform. The knowledge that Bones had built up through years at the Iski shop and hundreds of passes at Lyons and building the motor in the Masmanian car that first broke into the nines, all of that came together in this one combination. And it ran times that beat or matched anything in the class. And then the sport changed and left it behind. Not because the car was wrong or the team was wrong, but because the economics of drag racing were moving toward the funny car and eventually toward pro stock. And the gas class structure that had produced the gasser wars was dismantled by the same sanctioning body that had created it. NHRA eliminated the gas classes entirely in 1972. Pro stock debuted at the 1970 Winter Nationals and became the new home for stock-appearing high-performance racing. Everything that had happened in A/GS between 1958 and 1969 got absorbed into nostalgia faster than any of the people who lived through it probably expected. That's why there are Precision Miniatures diecasts and Jackson Brothers tapes and dedicated web pages and Hall of Fame entries. And that's why guys like Bones Balough can still show up at a drag racing event and have people who know the history treat him like exactly what he is. Because what he built in that era with Dubach and Pisano was real, and it was fast, and it ran at the top of the toughest class in drag racing at the moment that class was at its absolute peak. The people who were there know it, even if the Wikipedia article doesn't exist yet. The car that came back from Lyons in bare metal and ran 9.38 at Bakersfield against the best in the world was a product of a specific time and place and set of human relationships that couldn't have existed anywhere else. Bones building Hemi motors in the Iski shop for 6 years, learning things about camshaft profiles and valve timing events that nobody was writing down in textbook. Joe Pisano developing forged pistons that could survive 800 horsepower when cast pistons couldn't, solving a materials science problem from a small shop in Southern California because the racing community needed it solved. Gary Dubach providing a platform and a partnership that gave them somewhere to channel all of that knowledge and ambition. A 1933 Willys coupe that cost about $100 and weighed 2,000 pounds and had a 100-inch wheelbase, and became one of the most effective drag racing platforms ever built because of physics and class rules that nobody could have predicted when Willys Overland built it during the Depression to be the cheapest car in America. Where the car is now, nobody knows. But in 1967 at Indianapolis Raceway Park, it ran all the way to the final round of the NHRA U.S. Nationals and finished runner-up to Ohio George Montgomery, who had won that race 4 times before. That's the record. That happened. And if the car ever turns up in a barn somewhere, the doors are the giveaway. 2 original doors salvaged from the crash at Lyons drag strip, bolted onto a replacement body that was built in a hurry so they could make it to Bakersfield. And they didn't just make it. They showed up unpainted and unshaken down and beat stone, woods, cook on the first day out. That's the Bones Dubach Pisano 1933 Willys. 3 names on a door, a supercharged Hemi between the rails, and a story that deserves to be told until somebody finds that car and puts it where it belongs.